My name is Alex King. I'm head of customer success at NetNada. I'm very involved with helping a lot of our clients, specifically to what we're talking about today, improve whether it's their procurement policies or whether it's their strategies to align better with these larger corporate procurement strategies that we're seeing, especially obviously in the sustainability space. So that's a big focus of what we're going to be talking about today, giving you a bit of a rundown of the industry, of a lot of legislation that's coming through, and obviously how to prepare and how to take advantage of the opportunity that's already existing there. Also, just to start us off, we just wanted to start with an acknowledgement of country. So acknowledging all past, present and emerging Aboriginal and Indigenous figures. We gathered here today on Gadigal land in Sydney, and also extending our welcome and acknowledgement to any Indigenous or Torres Strait Islander people who are on this call. So to get started, this is a term that we use a lot at NetNada these days, and it certainly becomes more and more relevant each time we use it. And it's this idea of sustainability and sustainable compliance going from a nice to have to a license to operate. Previously when we were speaking to a lot of clients, potential clients, and just people within the space, it was something that potentially sustainability aligned with already a brand aspect. They were already seen as a green company or a sustainable company, and they wanted to bring in the data and the analysis that underpinned that claim so that there wasn't any greenwashing concerns, or they wanted to strengthen what they said in the market. What's now changed, especially in the last 6 to 7 months, is that this is now becoming a requirement, and it is now becoming a license to operate and a license to work with, especially larger corporates who are at the tip of that legislation impact, which we'll explain in a second. Again, we've kind of touched on all this. Really want to have this as a collaborative session, a bit of a small session today, which is great. We want to really continue to have these smaller sessions where we can speak to individual questions or individual queries, or potentially use some business cases from the people in the call today. So we are going to shift and focus on the points listed in this slide, but again, we really want to cater this to make sure that you're going to get some value out of it. So please, we'll have time for questions, and I'll just jump in, but everything you think of, I'll write down, and again, outside of this session as well, please get in contact with myself or Afonso. To quickly, as mentioned, to kind of take a step back and, why is it now a license to operate? Why was it previously nice to have, and all of a sudden it is a license to operate? And there's new legislation coming out every day, but the big piece that a lot of people talk to, the big piece that's driving a lot of change across Australia, is this climate-related financial disclosure consultation paper that came out in June 2023 and comes into effect really at the end of this financial year. And that was the Australian Treasury bringing in mandatory reporting requirements for starting off with larger companies with over 500 employees and certain amounts of revenue, but also laying out a roadmap to explaining that the next year is going to be 250, then the year after that 100 employees, and so on. So it's the first time we've seen mandatory reporting requirements come from the top-down Australian government, and that's not only just Scope 1 and Scope 2, but also includes Scope 3 emissions. We'll talk about the importance of and the impact of that, including Scope 3 emissions. Afonso will touch on it in a second, but this is the big piece. And they've also outlined the frameworks with which these larger companies will need to report in. And because of that, these larger companies are now looking across their supply chain and value chain to companies such as the ones in this call today. And that's why we're seeing a lot of pressures, and that's why we're seeing a lot of changes in these procurement strategies. Another, it's coming from all angles, so to speak, but from the net zero in government operation strategy released at the federal level as well, they've also outlined what their procurement strategy is going to be for the next 3 years. So what the Australian government is doing this year is doing a consultation across all of the work that they do with everything from SMEs to corporates, and they're going to be outlining and dictating what are the requirements needed to work with the government. And this is a really good indicator, like a yardstick to what it's going to be like to be required to work with these larger companies that are impacted by that climate-related financial disclosure. We had a bit more of a specific webinar looking just at the government relations rather than broader procurement strategies. And we had the ex-head of procurement, James Northall for New South Wales, talk to this point in particular and explain that what we'd seen previously is things like supply nation requirements to include, Indigenous suppliers, and then also the NDIS requirements for Indigenous suppliers. So we don't know exactly what the requirements of the government are going to be on the procurement strategies, but if we look to supply nation, if we look to NDIS, it will most likely be that you're scored better, that you're included in certain tenders if you do have certain reporting compliance. And then finally, there's a bunch of specific legislation. If you have questions, we can send through around agriculture, healthcare, construction. So all different levels from private, public, and then industry-specific legislation. So a lot of changes, a lot of impacts at the moment. Again, we'll send through these slides as well, so you can have a look at the sources. But to take it back a step, sustainable procurement, what is it? It is looking across these ESG factors and using them to score and influence how you're sourcing suppliers into your business, or how the government is, or how larger corporates are. We just touched on the overview of recent Australian government initiatives. I'll send through as like a follow-up resource some additional reading that you can look at. But the overall message is that it's coming thick and fast. We've seen an absolute avalanche of legislation in the last 6 months that are really changing and pushing along these changes. And then implications, benefits for your business is what we're going to speak about now. This as well, again, I'll keep this slide in here without getting too much into the weeds of specific legislation and sending everyone to sleep. But this is the big piece of legislation mentioned previously by the Australian government, and the ISSB reporting is the type of reporting requirement, reporting framework that all these larger corporates will need to be preparing their documents in such a way. So all of this, all you need to really know from a top line level is this change, or this requirement, is having a knock-on effect across the supply chain and value chain of all of these larger corporates. So if you're wanting to work and win more large corporate clients, then this is what is going to influence that ability.
Perfect. So thanks, Alex. Alex has been speaking about all this kind of legislation and what happened, and now I'm going to talk into some real life examples, and getting even down to the email level. What emails might you receive from your clients asking for this information? So here's a couple examples from the news. 3 big companies trying to influence their suppliers to lower their greenhouse gas emissions, and this is in the news, and it then transforms into like real action from the procurement manager and sustainability teams to get in touch with their suppliers, and you might be one of the suppliers. Another one was Amazon late last year as well, saying that for all their sellers on Amazon and also suppliers to the business, there was some change coming, especially when it comes to their own net zero goals. And some other examples is here in Australia in the property industry, actually tenants wanting to have green space, so actually paying with their wallet for warehouses that can offer things like carbon neutral energy or renewable energies. And of course, the other one as well in the pressure ramp up on supplies emissions was also focused in the property sector. As you have certain buildings in certain ways to operate, you're looking to find suppliers who can help you achieve those goals. So we have a mix of two things: companies trying to find the solutions that are more environmentally friendly, and also trying to de-risk their current suppliers to make sure they're aligned with those goals. Now, what does it look like for these large enterprise procurement guidelines? It looks that they are now introducing these ESG considerations in the buying process. So if they're vetting you as an existing or new supplier, it can touch on economy. What's the ROI of having you as a supplier? The social aspect, what is things like your modern slavery statement and your inclusion into the community. And lastly, where we're going to focus, the environment. What are your impacts, especially the carbon of you as a supplier, for the plant itself, but also for their own emissions and their own goals. Now, how and when and what are some terms you might be looking at as you try to upskill in this topic, to understand as you source new information and new knowledge to realize what matters to you. You want to look for the key scope 3 terms. So a supplier who now is tackling scope 3 emissions a client that is now tackling scope 3 emissions is a client who's looking to engage the suppliers on this decarbonization. From a technical aspect, it looks like this. Emissions are breaking into different buckets or different scopes. Everything that falls into those scope 3 emissions involves you as a supplier to these businesses. So you might have solutions, or you might be a service in some of these categories. Their objective as a larger enterprise is to starting to tackle down some of these categories and trying to find suppliers who can reduce them, or also remove existing suppliers who are not contributing in a way to reduce their emissions. So, for example, Stage Kings provides assistance with event setup in person, and it might be involved with that category here of purchased goods and services. They're now looking for services who have a more environmental lens associated with that. And therefore, they might pick one supplier versus the other if they can offer, end-of-use disposal of certain goods, or they're using certain types of fleets to achieve so. A lot of big focus as well on distribution and transportation, and anything that has to do processing some of those goods as a client as a service, also very relevant. So,
Afonso,
yeah.
sorry, one question that comes up a lot, and it'd be great for you to answer this for everyone, is that when they're de-risking, if we talk about the Atlassian example, they're de-risking their supply chain. What do you mean by de-risking their supply chain? And also, where does this cost analysis come into it? A lot of times clients ask, like, why do they care so much about contacting and looking across this when they can just do like a spend-based analysis on their suppliers?
Perfect. So de-risking is for two things. One is these larger companies have to foot the bill for things like offsetting, as an example. So if they want to plant some trees or invest any projects to kind of neutralize their emissions, what you provided to them is part of their responsibility. So that, of course, they want to have that bill be as low as possible. The other thing is that they might have investors like banks or private investors, and they want to invest in businesses that look at their supply chain and say, 50% of our suppliers have their own sustainability goals. And that's what de-risking is about. They don't want to be left out with a supplier who's still investing in a new fleet of, a normal car that is not electric, because they will be responsible for the emissions associated with that. So de-risking is just about understanding which ones are progressing with their own goals, because they know that in turn that's going to help them as well. That's clear?
Clear.
Awesome. So what does it actually look like? Day-to-day life, you're running your business, you have a fantastic client, and at one point in time you receive an email that might look like this. This might be from your contact within the company, or from a new group or team inside your client's company that asks you to fill out an assessment, a survey, a form that will have certain criteria within that. Normally, they will have reasons why they're asking this information. Things like compliance, or our investors are asking it for it, or it's part of our 2025 goals. It also normally have a deadline, so they might say suppliers have until end of financial year to provide this information, and they also might provide you with resources. For example, if you don't have certain aspects in this assessment, they might offer you some assistance or some resources for you to kind of go in and get the answers that you need. So it looks like something like this. This might be a link to an Excel spreadsheet, might be a link to a assessment tool that is digital. It might involve creating an account, as an example. In terms of what's inside the questionnaire, right? The questionnaire might offer several questions. It might focus just on emissions or emissions in the other aspects of ESG. And the problem here, most of the names and terminology used, you might not be familiar with. So you might need to do two things. One, upskill if you haven't done so. And secondly, answer or get those results. Most likely, some of the things like certification that they ask you about, they're not immediate to get. They take some time. Therefore, the whole thing about doing it before being asked, it's a better approach, because you become like a favorable supplier for them. And the other one is also understand cost, right? If you're asking all these questions and now you need to spend, $15,000 to get all the certification that's being asked, or put internal resources, it might be something that you might not be able to do as a business. So being able to look ahead and understand some of the key criteria from your suppliers of what's happening in your industry might facilitate that process. Alex, any things on here?
Yeah, it would be good if anyone wanted to put in the chat if you have received a questionnaire like this. And when I'm having conversations with customers and businesses we work with, a lot of the time it's when am I going to receive this? If June 30th is the cutoff date for reporting, am I waiting until the last minute to get in contact? And the answer is, the short answer is no. It's because a lot of these clients, these larger corporates who are doing this first iteration of their reporting are still figuring it out as well on their end, and it's going to come through, as Afonso mentioned, in different iterations, different versions. It might be a questionnaire, it might be a survey, but if you do receive one, again, we're always happy to kind of provide comment, provide insight on how to answer it. For example, one of a friend of mine who's a commercial plumber received one from a builder. It's very industry agnostic, but what you will be seeing is this engagement, whether it's a top level questionnaire like you see here, or if they're asking for something more specific, more technical, like a carbon intensity factor.
Yeah. So there's a lot of terms in here, and of course they go into things like certifications, into the emission measuring part, into the reduction kind of goals, and also the monitoring and practices. But most often when it comes to like tangible things you have to do as a business, it boils down to kind of four main things that we're seeing across industry. This public carbon inventory is the first step to all the other steps. This means, do you as a business measure and track your own emissions, right? So this involves doing a calculation of your carbon footprint. And you can engage a consultant, you can engage a software like NetNada, you can try to do it internally. And it's a step depending on the tool that you use that might take anything from 2 weeks to a few months, depending on data availability. And from that, you can procure the different things. One is, of course, making it public. So normally companies want to see that this is a public record, so it's available by everyone. So I might live on your website as an example. And then it trickles down to other certifications or actions you can take. Science-based targets is a very common certification process, which involves your business deciding when it wants to be net zero. Most companies are looking at 2030 as an example, 2035, and this involves like a public statement and involves answering a series of questions, and you go into a bucket of companies who have committed to these sustainability goals based on science to keep the planet from warming 1.5 degrees. The cost for this is minimal, and when it comes to the submission, but of course, answering the questions and having the carbon inventory available might take some time. The other one that is very commonly seen, it makes you look very sophisticated and committed, is the climate disclosure project. So this is about, you've measured emissions, you have it up on your website, but you've made it in a consistent way that is aligned with the climate disclosure project. So costs on this for a small SME might range between the $500 and $1,500. For a large enterprise, it gets a bit more expensive. But large enterprise use the climate disclosure project to assess the suppliers. So if they look through there and it's your name, they can already de-risk you and have the tick. Now, the other thing that I mentioned here in smaller letters, it's carbon neutrality. Or becoming carbon neutral. This involves when you neutralize your emissions and you kind of invest on tree planting activities or cook stove projects around the world or deforestation projects, and involves taking the information coming from your public carbon inventory and investing in offsets. This is what we've mentioned, that some companies have to foot the bill to neutralize those emissions. You as an SME or a small company can also do that. Of course, it's not mandatory, but it's normally like a natural step if you want to invest in some aspects of your business. The last slide, of course, is just emphasizing that the focus to get everything started is that carbon inventory, and either if you do it internally or you use a consultant or a software, it's about getting that step done. So when the time comes, you can quickly get your science-based targets or CDP submission in.
Yeah. And I think something else to note here is, and it's a query or question that comes up all the time, especially when people are doing their first, public carbon inventory. And it's like they get this score, they get these tons of CO2e for the year, and they go, well, is this really bad, or is this a bad score? Or sometimes they might be a little reticent to be sharing it publicly. And it's obviously a common query. Where do I sit against other companies or other industries? Now, we were recently at a talk in Bloomsburg with which a representative from the Australian Treasury was speaking, and they said the worst score you can get from if we were doing a scoring category is non-disclosure, is not reporting or not publicly sharing your carbon inventory, because the big focus across the industry, across all these different levels at the moment, is just transparency and reporting. So it's not so much about, is it a bad score, is it a good score, because it's not possible for us to compare apples to apples. People are doing different reporting, different inclusions, exclusions. So the point is just to focus around disclosing, being transparent, and ensuring that it aligns with GHG protocols and other respected protocols. You're in good stead. That's the best possible start you can do to have a positive engagement, positive relationship with current larger corporates or potentially new larger clients.
Perfect. And now we just want to see some case studies. Again, back to those examples on the news. This is more about those companies, for example, AstraZeneca, aligning with science-based targets and expecting their even small suppliers to do the same. Same thing with the City of Melbourne, kind of having their own procurement framework where people doing any tenders and submissions and proposals can have a look and align themselves with. So really good places to look, what is being requested. And of course, here's that the last one is that roadmap for new contracts when it comes to the carbon reduction plans. So there's a lot of documentation for you about focusing on those specific questionnaires and certifications that can put you to the top of the list when it comes to getting the ball rolling. This is again just emphasizing, after we spoke about all of this, you now understand why we're calling it license to operate, is because you might actually lose dollar values of contracts by not having these. Of course, there's other benefits like employee engagements, retention, sometimes access to grants and special loans. But from that sales of staying in business, this is why we're calling it license to operate, because you need these measurements, you need those certifications to be able to kind of maintain your relationship. Last thing we want to touch on is just addressing some of the challenges and roadblocks for the companies like yourselves. Internal resources. This might be that you might not have an internal champion. So a good example, like I spoke to Luisa, is one of our clients. She is the internal champion and the one responsible to do these calculations, to look at reductions and certifications. But your organization might not have a defined champion yet. So trying to allocate who's going to take on this responsibility might take some time, or even like hire a consultant, or just upskilling someone to use a software. Where to start? This is what we're trying to kind of answer here is, there's so many questions and requirements. What is important for me? The first place is that measurement aspect, because on top of the measurement, you can get any certifications, right? And like Alex is saying, the sooner you do that, the better, because it buys you time to then go, okay, which matters to me, or what is my industry looking for? And then you can pursue the certifications. Lastly is quality of data. As you embark on this journey of measurement, you might not have everything readily available to you, and there might be steps to the quality of your measurement. Like Alex was saying, disclosure is the first step. So even though you might have everything completely entailed or onboarded or quality checked, having some measurement is that first step. So this is a work in progress, but the sooner you start, the earlier you can identify some gaps and engage, your team, your suppliers, your executive team to kind of provide you with better access. Lastly, some other things we want to touch on in terms of obstacles is the calculate before trying to reduce. It might be really easy to kind of go, okay, I'm just going to invest in a EV fleet for my business, or change, the 2 company cars from this to that. Being able to communicate the change and the impact tells a good story to your suppliers, to your employees, and to your audience in general. So understanding the impact of your current activities versus what you're going to change to is really important. Secondly is, of course, aligning with these frameworks and certifications. If you're going to do it, might as well do it in a way that you can reuse and repurpose your measurements. And lastly, the point that we want to bring home in this last 2 minutes is, transparency over neutrality, or transparency over action, in terms of like, I'm not doing anything. Because your biggest enemy here is saying that you want to, you're going to have to spend a lot of money to achieve carbon neutrality, or a lot of money to do the measurement. An incomplete measurement or a first measurement is better than no measurement, and that's what goes into that score and that procurement process. Do you want to add anything in here?
No, nothing there. I guess one of the just final kind of strategies or challenges or barriers to getting started, a really common query we hear from a lot of clients, like, we're very small, we don't really have an impact, what difference can we actually make? And the difference that you can actually make is very much linked to this ability to engage with upstream into your value chain. So you can move quickly, you can make internal decisions quickly, you can offset to carbon neutrality or reach carbon neutrality or disclose quite easily, which means that you can then get to this overall objective that we've been touching on of de-risking in the eyes of what supply chain you're participating in. And that's where you can start to get on the front foot and engage these larger clients and let them know what you're doing, let them know you have a carbon intensity score, you have a public carbon inventory, and that's where you can really start to see a lot of benefit, potentially winning more work or engaging potentially lost or new clients.
And what we see as well happening as a good example is, if you as a supplier to a business, you actually reach out and you tell them about your progress, you might save them some work because, oh, this is what a leading supplier is already doing. I might as well align to what he's already providing. And you kind of like saving them time and effort to try to understand, how they're going to ask the questions and what they're going to ask, because you've already done that on their behalf. And then of course, it's like, what does a nice timeline looks like? And I highlighted a couple of things, and I want to focus on those two months. In that first month of taking the initiative to measure your emissions, you might already have something to show your suppliers. This be your public disclosure, and then on that second month, you might as well have a certification like the Science-Based Targets or the CDP. So in those first 2 months, or investing in the strategy, you might have some deliverables to kind of get going with, kind of flag you as a preferred supplier or showcasing your audience and your employees that you're moving in the right direction. Everything else from that is, of course, preparing better data, better other certifications, carbon neutrality, communication and engagement. But in those first 2 months, you might already get some really value add from taking this initiative. And then the last thing we want to say is, we've touched on multiple things, the reason why this change is happening, but the main focus of this webinar was about some of those real practical questions you're getting from the suppliers that you'll start getting, and things that you want to communicate to your audience. So if you have any questions on those, what are science-based targets, what are CDP, feel free to ask them now. But if not, we're also happy to kind of touch base later with more resources. Alex, you want to add anything?
No, that's it. And again, look, any other questions that have arisen, we've dove very, very deeply into one small category of the broader sustainability piece. We're always more than happy to answer any questions that may have stemmed from other aspects we've touched on. So please reach out, put them in the chat now, or get in touch directly, and we'll stay on for a little bit to answer.